this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
During the Second World War, the Home Intelligence Unit, a branch of the Ministry of Information, was tasked with monitoring public attitudes on the home front. They compiled confidential reports on the state of popular morale, which was circulated among decision makers in Whitehall. These reports offer a fascinating insight into how ordinary people coped with the stresses of wartime life, their hopes for victory and their fears about what the post-war world might bring. I'm Angus Wallace, and joining me today is Jeremy Crang, Professor of Modern British History at the University of Edinburgh. Together with his late colleague Paul Addison, Jeremy has edited 3 volumes of these reports, bringing to light the voices and concerns of wartime Britain. Jeremy, thank you for joining me. I've been reading your latest book, Our People's War, which is the third in the trilogy, looking at the reports from the Home Intelligence Unit. I wonder, perhaps our starting point, do you want to surmise how the 3 volumes relate to one another?
Well, thanks for having me on, Angus. During the Second World War, a Home Intelligence Unit within the Ministry of Information quite closely monitored public opinion in Britain and compiled regular reports on morale. These reports are located in the National Archives at Kew in London. And in 2010, my late colleague Paul Addison and I published a complete set of these home intelligence reports for the period May-September 1940. And that was under the title of Listening to Britain. And then in 2020, we then published a complete set of the reports for the period September 1940 to June 1941 under the title The Spirited Blitz. And this recent book is entitled Our People's War, and it completes a trilogy of home intelligence volumes, and it incorporates a selection of the reports for the period June 1941 to December 1944, and that was when home intelligence closed down. So that's how the project sort of fits together.
It's not necessarily a book you read from cover to cover. It's kind of a book you pick through by topic. Well, we'll perhaps get to that later, but we're talking about the Home Intelligence Unit, which I suspect most people won't know what it is. And when we start to explain it, we have to be careful, because this is not mass observation, which I suspect is what most people think it is.
Well, that's right. Well, it did. We can talk a bit about that later on, but there was a connection with mass observation in the early years. But I suppose the place to start is that in the 21st century, we kind of take it for granted that we're under continuous surveillance. Social surveys, opinion polls, internet search engines, social media, artificial intelligence. We're probably being monitored 24 hours a day. But of course, the situation at the outbreak of the war in 1939 was very different. And the political classes relied mainly on the press, which is a highly unreliable source as a guide to public opinion. However, when a Ministry of Information was created in Britain at the outbreak of the war to help maintain morale on the home front, it was decided that it needed its own independent source of intelligence on public attitudes if it was to ensure the public's full cooperation in the war effort, and also bridge the gap between the leaders and the led, as it were. So Home Intelligence Unit was created in the Ministry of Information. It was based at the Senate House at the University of London, and its job was to compile regular reports on the state of public morale. And these were issued, first of all, daily from May to September 1940, and then weekly thereafter until Home Intelligence was, as I say, closed down in December 1944. And these reports came to be circulated around Whitehall and other branches of government.
This is a new concept, really. Polling. It's not really polling people, surveying people. It's of their opinions on various things. So when you're forming a new unit on something that I guess is a new idea, who are you employing to pull all this together? Because it sounds really daft. It's groundbreaking for what it's doing at that point in time.
Yes, it was fairly novel. I mean, the unit was set up under somebody called Mary Adams. Now, Adams was one of the many temporary wartime civil servants whose recruitment to Whitehall introduced a rather unorthodox element into the pre-war establishment. So if you think about it, the archetypal senior civil servant was male, upper middle class, ex-public school boy, ex-Oxbridge, graduate in the humanities. And Adams was very, very different. She was a scholarship girl from a modest background. She was a graduate in botany from the University of Cardiff. And before the war, she'd been the first female television producer, broadcasting from Alexandra Palace. But when that service closed down, she was free to take on a new challenge, and she founded In Home Intelligence. She was married to the Conservative MP, Vivian Adams, but she herself was described by her daughter as a socialist, a romantic communist, a fervent atheist, an advocate of humanism and common sense. Now, Adams recruited a cast of quite interesting characters to work under her at the Home Intelligence. I mean, almost maybe sort of characters from an Evelyn Waugh novel. So one of her early recruits was the artist Nicholas Bentley. He'd drawn illustrations for the books of humorous authors such as J.B. Morton of the Daily Express. Another Adams recruit was the poet and writer Winifred Holmes. She was part of a literary circle that included T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden and Christopher Isherwood. However, in order perhaps to sort of balance the artistic abilities of Bentley and Holmes with a more sort of scientific mind, a more scientific perspective, she also recruited Dr. Stephen Taylor. He was later to become Lord Taylor. Now, he was a neuropsychiatrist. She invited him onto the radio during her times as a talk producer at the BBC. And so she knew him and she got him released from the Navy. He was actually a doctor in the Navy at the outbreak of the war. She got him released to join her. Subsequently, Taylor was to take over from Adams as head of Home Intelligence in the spring of 1941. So that was sort of how the thing was established.
It's such an eclectic group of people. If you sat down from an academic point of view and think, well, we need to do this, you would be having statisticians and not artists and poets. So does that affect, what sources are they drawing on under Mary Adams? Is it reflected I don't like to use the word, but airy-fairiness of their sort of backgrounds?
Well, yes, it does. It becomes even more colourful in a sense. Home Intelligence was founded on the assumption that no single source could be relied upon as an accurate measure of morale, and so Adams drawn a whole range of sources. So these included reports from the Ministry of Information's own regional information officers across the United Kingdom. She drew on material from the Wartime Social Survey, which is a unit which was attached to the ministry. Information came from the postal and the telephone censors, from chief constables, from the BBC's Listener Research Department, from voluntary organisations such as the Women's Institute, the Citizens Advice Bureau. Also at this time, they collected information from the managers of Odeon cinemas, presumably on audience reactions to newsreels, and also from the railway station bookstalls of W.H. Smith and Sons, presumably on commuters' conversations on station platforms. We can only surmise. But however, perhaps the most important, and this goes back to something you said earlier, perhaps the most important of Home Intelligence's sources in this early period was the independent social research organisation Mass Observation. Now, this was led by Tom Harrison, who Adams knew from her work at the BBC before the war. Harrison was a brilliant but maverick self-taught social anthropologist. He dropped out of Cambridge University as a student and he'd embarked on a life of adventure, taking part in expeditions to the South Seas and living amongst cannibals. In the late 1930s, he'd co-founded Mass Observation with the aim of creating a social anthropology of the British people, a bit like observing them as though they were some sort of hitherto unknown tribe. Um, so Mass Observation had at its disposal a nationwide panel of volunteers who responded by post to requests for their observations and their opinions, but they also employed a team of full-time paid observers, and they conducted interviews in the street, they watched people's behavior, they eavesdropped in their conversations, they recorded their unguarded remarks. These were the early sources that were being used by home intelligence.
It's almost like snooping on what everybody's doing without them. Actually, that said, they can't necessarily be accused of being snooping, because if they're approaching managers of the Odeon or the Women's Institute, they must have been fairly open, whoever their data collectors were, saying, look, we're asking these questions. So you kind of got two arms, a covert operation, an overt operation.
Maybe it's eavesdropping, is the word.
Yes. Yeah. So I guess the big test of how this information's feeding back, looking at morale, would be the Blitz in 1940. What do the reports tell us about the experience of the British people and bombing?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, the mass bombing of civilians posed, or so it was thought, the greatest of all threats to civilian morale, and home intelligence obviously reported in detail on the quite complex reaction of civilians under the bombs, and also, reported on the many complaints that were levelled at the inefficiency of the local authorities, the lack of provision for the homeless, the poor quality of air raid shelters, the confusing character of air raid warnings, and so on. Now, according to the reports, the first few days of the Blitz on London gave rise to shock amongst all sort of social classes and all the districts. And in the eye of this particular storm, the people of the Docklands, of course, who bore the brunt of the attack, I think the report states they showed visible signs of nerve cracking from constant ordeals. But having said that, there was no mass panic, there's no breakdown of public order, there's no collapse of morale, nor did it collapse in any of the other towns and cities that were bombed by the Luftwaffe. But beyond this point, however, I think it's quite difficult to generalize about the impact of the Blitz from the reports. I mean, what home intelligence, I think, discovered was that the reactions to the Blitz depended on a range of factors, such as the resilience of individuals, the pattern and intensity of the raids, the size and the topography of the cities attacked, and the special reports that home intelligence conducted on particular localities like Coventry and Clydebank, Plymouth, Portsmouth, Hull, Merseyside. I think they showed that the impact of the bombing could vary from place to place. And in fact, levels of morale could vary between one part of a town and another. In the case of Hull, which suffered heavy raids in March of 1941, the reports painted a very somber picture of the St Paul's district of the city, where the immediate post-raid reaction was, I think, described as complete helplessness and resignation. And this was attributed to the social conditions of poverty and very bad housing in the area. The North Hull estate in the city, by contrast, seemed to cope much better. And in the words of home intelligence, and I quote, gave a remarkable demonstration of high morale. We can frankly state that in not one single case did we see any undue fear or weakening of morale. However, whilst, I mean, home intelligence, I think, acknowledged the great resilience of the majority of those in the Blitz towns, and also, I think, the extraordinary capacity of people to adjust to the Blitz conditions, it did also uncover some uncomfortable truths about life under the bombs. And for example, I'll just read you an extract of a report in May on conditions in Portsmouth, which revealed a worrying level of bomb-related crime. On all sides, it was reported, we heard that looting and wanton destruction had reached alarming proportions. The police seem unable to exercise control, and we heard many tales of the wreckage of shelters and of stealing from damaged houses, and were told that some people were afraid to take shelter in an attack for fear of being robbed of their remaining possessions. The effect on morale is bad, and there's a general feeling of desperation as there seems to be no solution. And also, to add to this, of course, naturally, the bombing of Britain's civilians gave rise to demands for reprisal raids against Germany. In the early stages of the Blitz, this seemed to emanate mainly from parts of Britain that had not experienced the bombing. The Blitz went on, the demand for reprisals, I think, spread across the country. So in December 1940, Home Intelligence reported the time had come to stop the slogan, "Britain can take it." The public was now more concerned about giving it. And then you go forward 2 or 3 months to March 1941, and Home Intelligence was warning that the British bombing policy was flabby. And it was suggested that the RAF should, and I quote, lay off military objectives for a few nights and instead annihilate 1 or 2 German towns, preferably Berlin. Yeah, and this is where all these kind of cross currents come together. This sort of quest for vengeance was then counterbalanced by small acts of compassion. At Barking in London, it's reported that when some German airmen were buried, a woman put a wreath on a coffin, which was inscribed with the words, "To son, mother's son." Home Intelligence noted that the crowd showed no hostile feeling at this action and appeared rather to approve. So I think the experience under the bombs is quite complex.
Perhaps to talk of the Blitz is a bit too much of an umbrella term. It's similar to the idea of the Blitz spirit. It is a wonderful Second World War propaganda phrase that now comes down through the decades that probably isn't very realistic to what the people at the time were feeling or facing universally.
Yes, it did vary, I think, across the period and depending on where you live.
Yes, and it's reflecting upon that. I was thinking about my mother's idea of the Blitz, who lived in rural Yorkshire, was all the refugees arriving. But then she said, "Oh, and then they went back." So my mother's idea of the Blitz was actually not the Blitz. It was the time before the Blitz when everyone was evacuated and then went back, which is interesting to reflect upon all this time later, that her idea of the Blitz isn't the Blitz, the Blitz before. But anyway. So Mary Adams did she resign? I've forgotten. Is she resign at the end of the day?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Replaced by Stephen Taylor, who is with somewhat more of a scientific background. Does he change how the unit operates?
Yes, he did change the way that intelligence was collected. Now, he had some doubts about the reliability of Mab's observations reports. In fact, he described Tom Harrison in his memoirs as a journalist masquerading as a scientist. And he actually sidelined mass observation, and instead he decided to strengthen the Ministry of Information's own regional intelligence gathering organization. So from the summer of 1941, regional intelligence officers were appointed in the Ministry of Information regions across the United Kingdom. Now, these intelligence officers were tasked with compiling weekly reports for the Home Intelligence headquarters in London on public opinion in their individual regions. Now, to help them in this task, they were to create panels of regional contacts to essentially eavesdrop on the British people and provide the raw material from which their reports could be compiled. Now, these contacts were to be recruited across each region on a ratio of roughly 1 to every 10,000 head of population. And they were to be recruited from among men and women who were regarded as sensible and level-headed and sympathetic to the work of home intelligence. And also, of course, importantly, they were to be in occupations that came into contact with large numbers of the public, people each day. So the types of contacts suggested were doctors, clergymen, shopkeepers, publicans, librarians, teachers, trade union officials, factory welfare workers, these sorts of people. And the contacts in a region were to be asked to report on the spontaneous attitudes of people they met on a whole range of sort of home front issues. And the guidance emphasized that this process was not about snooping on the public, but observing and relating what people thought and what they said. So by the spring of 1942, the regional intelligence officers had recruited between about 200 and 400 contacts in their regions. Not all of these contacts were called upon each week because they wanted to reduce the demands on them and they wanted to avoid making them stale. But it was reckoned that a minimum of 30 of them, and often a good many more, contributed to each of these weekly regional reports. And each week, these regional reports are sent off to Home Intelligence HQ in London. And in London, they're consolidated into a weekly national report.
It's an enormous network of people. So you've got the local regional guy, then with these 500 people. It's a huge network of people that they're drawing on. That they've, for a unit that, if you say at the start, if you ask people, they'll go, mass observation. No, it's not mass observation at all. And so how do you then take all this information that's coming in? Because presumably you'll have to also filter it, because there must be, I mean, did they even consider the bias of those people collecting the reports? Because doctors, managers, they're all tends to be middle-class occupations. Even the trade unionists might be seen as not necessarily being that close to the coalface.
Yes, that's right. I mean, that's something that they were worried about, whether they could really sort of get at real working class opinion. But I mean, the process is by which the national report comes about is essentially the 13 weekly, and there are 13 weekly regional intelligence reports are then sent to the headquarters of Home Intelligence in London. Incidentally, I mean, by the spring of 1942, there's about a dozen staff in total in the Home Intelligence headquarters. And there, these regional reports they're cross-referenced and they're synthesized for the consolidated national report. The compilers only included statements in the national reports if there was considerable regional evidence to support them. And the space that is devoted to each topic and the order in which the topics are placed come to be roughly indicative of the amount of public interest a subject was arousing at a particular time.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. Because there's a big piece on bicycle batteries, and I thought, bicycle light batteries, so that must have been nationally cropped up in numerous conversations. And I think that's a really obscure, specific thing to talk about.
That was clearly something that was happening in more than one region. So the intelligence from the regions is then supplemented by other available sources that they have in London. So they've got the Wartime Social Survey, they've got BBC Listener Research, they've got the Postal Census, they've got the Police Duty reports. The Gallup polls of the British Institute of Public Opinion also become a regular feature of the reports. So they pull all this together. And from the spring of 1942, the weekly reports are issued on a Thursday. And they decided this was the optimal day. They need to allow the regional intelligence officers the maximum time to compile and dispatch their reports to London, but they also had to give the headquarters staff in London enough time to prepare the consolidated report and try and get it circulated before the weekend. By 1943, the weekly circulation list, and that is outside the Ministry of Information, had grown to 148 copies. So the recipients of the reports come to include all the other Whitehall departments. The reports are going to all cabinet offices, 10 Downing Street, Buckingham Palace, US Embassy, British ambassador in Moscow, and so on. These are the sort of people that are receiving these reports.
It's a surprisingly small selection of people for such a large occupation. So, what are the reports covering in these sort of latter years? Does it shift? Does their focus shift from purely looking at morale?
Well, I think it goes a little bit beyond morale. Yes, you're right.
Because we're obviously starting to not lose.
No, quite right. No, exactly right. I mean, the job of monitoring the state of popular morale, of course, leads Home Intelligence or gives Home Intelligence the freedom to inquire into almost every aspect of life on the home front. And I think if you read the reports, you'll see that. So, for example, there's a lot of coverage in the reports of the public's reaction to the major military events of the period. So, you'll read about the public reactions to the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the fall of Singapore, the surrender of Tobruk, defense of Stalingrad, the British and Commonwealth victory at Al Alamein, defeat of Italy, strategic bombing of Germany, the North landing. So it's a roll call of the major military events. There's also a lot of material on the continuing stresses and strains of life on the home front, the blackout, rationing, fuel economy, public transport, billeting, income tax, industrial relations, and of course, not to mention the V weapon attacks of 1944, which brought back a lot of the terrors of the Blitz. And Home Intelligence was also not averse to looking into wider social problems such as juvenile delinquency and anti-Semitism, friction with US servicemen, and so on. Running alongside all this, the reports increasingly come to feature the public's hopes and fears about the post-war world, and Home Intelligence carefully monitored attitudes to the Beveridge report, as well as other aspects of Reconstruction. So readers do get an insight into the many-sided experience of living through what has been termed the People's War. Another, I think, illuminating aspect of the reports, I think, are the references to the sort of smaller wartime episodes that caught the attention of the public at the time, but in many cases I think are now forgotten. I mean, some of these episodes have a kind of semi-comic aspect to them. I mean, for example, it was interesting to read about a scandal that engulfed the city council in Newcastle in February 1944, after it was alleged that a fire engine had been sold off at a knockdown price for scrap to a welding company connected to the councillor who administered the fire brigade. Now, this led to a Home Office inquiry that uncovered a number of irregularities in the administration of the city's civil defence services and a lot of mixing up of private and public affairs. And Home Intelligence reported a host of crude jokes about public officials in the north of England and a desire on the part of some people to, and I quote, shoot the lot of them. So some of these episodes have a more redeeming quality to them. And in August 1943, the reports picked up on the refusal of the Imperial Hotel in Russell Square in London to provide accommodation for the celebrated West Indian Test cricketer Leary Constantine and his family. When he was playing for a Dominion's cricket 11 against England at Lord's, and the hotel refused him and his family accommodation. Now, this blatant act of racial discrimination led to a public outcry about what the reports described as Hitlerite practices in Britain. And Home Intelligence actually reported that members of the public thought that Mr. Constantine should be invited to lunch at Buckingham Palace to make amends for this insult. There are also very tragic episodes. I mean, I was particularly moved when I came across a passing reference in the reports, this is in August 1944, to the Freckleton disaster, which is said to have deeply shocked the public. Now, I knew nothing about this event, but On investigation, I found out that in August 1944, a US Liberator bomber had crashed onto the village of Freckleton in Lancashire. This is a training flight during a thunderstorm. And along with the crew, 58 villagers had been killed, including 38 infants at the village school. Now, one can hardly imagine what the impact that disaster must have had on that village. And one wonders if the impact is still felt today. And just as a sort of brief aside to this, I was recently reading an account of one of the children, or a child survivor of this disaster. And she recalled that Bing Crosby had come to visit the injured children in hospital to sing for them. But when he saw how badly injured they were, he actually broke down and he couldn't sing in the ward and he had to sing to them from the corridor. So very, very sad. And but I think, the reports do, it's like sort of archaeology. If you dig around, these are some of the wartime episodes that, come to light through the reports that, as I say, maybe forgotten.
Yeah, I was fascinated because I went through on looking at manpower as the theme I was going through looking at. It was interesting how people were not fingering other people, but sort of complaining that there was too many civil servants, or they might be looking at unnecessary use of private cars. And it's almost like the population seemed to be behind the war, but they want an equality. They want an equality of sacrifice. Viewing it, because the funniest slight aside I bumped into was a peculiar reference to Bletchley Park, and they'd been talking about too many young men of middle class background hiding in the civil service, and then pointed to Bletchley Park. And I thought, well, that's a fascinating observation, because clearly no one would know what was going on in Bletchley Park, and they felt it was a hiding place for intelligent young men.
Yes, little did they know what was happening.
Exactly. It was just one of those little, throwaway pieces. It was not much, but what you can now, the context that you can now add to that report. Do they get as far as Churchill? Does he review them?
Yes, I mean we could talk a little about Whitehall if you want.
Well, do they provide a feedback loop for Whitehall? Can we see changes to policy from them?
No, that's right. That's right. Yes, I mean, in the early phase of the war, Home Intelligence had quite a difficult relationship with some parts of Whitehall. I mean, as you can imagine, harassed government officials didn't always appreciate it when their departments came under attack in the reports, especially as these reports are going around other Whitehall departments. And in particular, the Home Intelligence's relationship with the Home Office was quite fractious, and some Home Office staff found it, I think, quite hard to understand that when the Home Intelligence reports complained, for example, about shortcomings in civil defence measures, they were not actually dealing in authenticated fact, but they were dealing in popular perceptions of what was happening. And this led, to quite a lot of frustration on the part of Mary Adams, and these sort of turf wars contributed, I think, to her departure as head of Home Intelligence. Taylor, when he took over from Adams, I think was much more canny in his dealings with Whitehall. I mean, the fact that he was psychiatrist gave him a certain professional standing, I think, with government circles. And he could also actually be very disarming in his dealings with civil servants. So apparently at meetings, he had a habit of chewing his handkerchief as though it was a lettuce. And he skillfully exploited this quirk to deflate the more pompous and obstructionist type of officials who didn't know quite how to react to this eccentricity whilst they're waiting for an answer to their often rather barbed questions, and he's chomping away. He also worked quite hard behind the scenes, I think, to convince departmental officials that the recording of a public misapprehension in the Home Intelligence Force didn't actually imply its endorsement. So I think Taylor did smooth over relations in Whitehall, and in the main, I think government officials did come to value his reports. I mean, in fact, in 1943, the Ministry of Information, they wrote to 142 recipients on the external circulation list, and they asked them for their candid opinion as to the usefulness of the reports, and they asked them whether their withdrawal would actually deprive them of a useful service. And the response was actually very encouraging. The ministry received, I think, 114 replies. 102 wished for the reports to continue. 8 didn't, and 4 were indeterminate. So Taylor described the responses as overwhelmingly favourable. So I think, yes, I think many officials around Whitehall thought they were useful, if nothing else, but to just give them a general feeling for the sort of, the shifts in public opinion and the ebbs and flows.
One would assume that sometimes the policies are in place, but they're not necessarily communicated. And one might then, as a department head, go, actually, we know we're doing it right. They just don't know they're doing it right. So perhaps we just need to work on our public relations.
And you mentioned Churchill. I mean, given the circulation of the reports to Downing Street, it was inevitable that they would come to the attention of the Prime Minister. And indeed, in the spring of 1942, he sent one of his famous minutes to the Minister of Information, who was Brendan Bracken. And I might just quote this. There is hardly anything in this which could not have been written by a man sitting in a London office and imagining the echoes in the country to the London press. I doubt very much whether this survey is worth its trouble. How many people are engaged upon it, and how much does it cost? Well, of course, this was quite an ominous intervention, but Taylor had cultivated the support of the Prime Minister's personal assistant, a man called Major Desmond Morton. He'd also cultivated his doctor, Sir Charles Wilson, later Lord Moran. And the Minister of Information hierarchy also backed him. I mean, Bracken, who was one of Churchill's most trusted conservative allies and confidants, he replied to the Prime Minister that while he conceded that a plausible weekly intelligence report could be compiled by one man sitting in a London office and using his imagination, the important thing was the fact that reports were not written in this way, and that they represented, as you mentioned earlier, a genuine collection of opinions from a very large number of independent, non-official people all over the country. And actually, fortunately, this seemed to satisfy Churchill, and Home Intelligence was allowed to continue its business. And in fact, over the summer of 1942, and this is, remember, a time when there was quite a good deal of concern in government circles about the state of public morale, Bracken submitted periodic summaries of home opinion to the cabinet, war cabinet, which were actually based on the weekly Home Intelligence reports. And in fact, in August of 1943, the Prime Minister, Churchill, even directed that a verbatim extract from one of the reports. This was a report that featured an assessment of public attitudes to the bombing of Allied bombing of Rome. He actually directed that a verbatim extract should be included amongst the war cabinet papers. So Home Intelligence survived Churchill's misgivings.
Well, he was, always wanted to change his mind. So when you look at great events of the war, those points that we have, Israel Alamein, but I was thinking more, the 80th anniversary of D-Day was this year. What does the Home Intelligence reports have to say about the public reactions to those events, which might seem a long way away? I mean, they're significant now, but are they significant then?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that and in the weeks and the months leading up to D-Day, Home Intelligence is reporting there's a lot of public speculation about where and when the invasion is going to take place, and also a lot of growing anxiety about the forthcoming assault. And of course, all of this becomes more feverish as the public began to read the signs that something imminent was about to happen. When they read about coastal bans imposed along the south coast of England, when they read about the suspension of certain diplomatic rights, when there were bans put on travel to Ireland, when they saw American troops disappearing from their regular locations. So they knew something's happening. And then, of course, when 6th of June came, Home Intelligence captured a moment of really high public emotion. I mean, if I could just quote you the report from that week. At last, "Thank God it started" sums up the general feeling of profound relief from the tension and the strain of waiting. Many were surprised when the news first broke, having expected a more sensational start, more fuss and dislocation of civilian life. Some cheered, some wept hysterically, some felt flattened out, sick in the stomach. The great majority, however, are described as confident, calm, and steady, and excitement, even when intense, is usually restrained. There is too much anxiety for the safety of those taking part, relatives and especially women being particularly fearful. Many find it too big to talk about. It's interesting to observe that while the public are very pleased, of course, with the progress of the invasion in the days and weeks that followed, they were also a bit perplexed about the reaction of the people in Normandy. Now, Home Intelligence reported that there were stories circulating that the French were sullen and ungrateful for their liberation, that some French women married to German soldiers were sniping at Allied soldiers, and that the people of France seemed to be much better off for food and clothing than the people of Britain. Now, whatever the truth of these rumours, and I should just say that the military authorities didn't find any authenticated cases of French civilian snipers, but there's clearly a sort of simmering, an underlying suspicion of the French. It's also a case that, of course, there are other things happening on the home front around D-Day that the public were concerned about. So, in the northeast region, for example, there had been devastating floods on the 29th of May that had killed several people in Holmfirth, done much damage to the town. People in the area are still reeling from that. Likewise, in the eastern region, a fire on an ammunition train at Soham Station in Cambridgeshire, 2nd of June. That might have had catastrophic consequences for the town if it hadn't been for the real gallantry of the train crew, both of whom I should say were later awarded the George Cross. And there's much speculation, in the area about the cause of this near disaster. And of course, perhaps most notably, the first V1 weapon attacks on Britain were launched on the 13th of June. It's interesting that within a couple of weeks of D-Day, the flying bomb attacks on London and the southeast, these had become the chief topic of conversation for the British people. So I think the reports do give us an interesting perspective, both on the sort of different layers of public opinion, but also on the chronology of events.
It's easy to think that people would become obsessive over following the news, but you kind of remember there's a lot of other things going along in their lives. You say the V1s, V2, and actually, so it might be the top headline, but it moves off in people's immediate lives as other things become important. Now, it's wound up in, is it early 1945, end of 44?
End of 44, yes.
End of 44, which I find interesting because we've obviously got the general election looming. I just wondered how much of these reports, because you sort of said they're starting to look at more social concerns. Do the reports foreshadow the coming of the Labour government, which perhaps if Churchill had been keener following these reports, he might have been able to avoid?
Well, yes. I mean, Home Intelligence had to be very careful that it didn't get involved in party politics or Ross's politically biased. It's a coalition government, you've got to remember.
You can see it being a useful thing to draw on.
Yes. But if one looks closely at the reports, one can see clues as to the way in which the wind is blowing politically. And let me just give you one example. In February 1942, Home Intelligence was reporting that more and more people were taking to, and I quote, a kind of homemade socialism. And the following month, it actually decided, this was interesting, and it decided to conduct an in-depth investigation of this phenomenon across the regions. And nearly all the regions reported that something of this kind was in the making. The North Midland region, for example, commented on a strong tendency towards the ideal of socialism in all classes, and suggested this was due to levelling up of classes from the bombing and from rationing, partly from the Russian successes, partly from the blaming of vested interests, or for all the problems of war production, and also partly because of the fear that conditions after the last war were going to be repeated. And in summing up the regional reports, Home Intelligence concluded that there was a widespread revulsion against privilege, against vested interests, and the old gang, as they described it, and a strong belief that there had to be, alterations in the present order of society. That's what was written after the war. So the leftward shift was apparent here, and of course, as you say, this would eventually translate into a Labour landslide in 1945.
Yeah, it's almost more. It's the acceptance of some form of welfare state having been through the war, irrespective necessarily who's bringing it in. We want more of this kind of thing that some respects the war brings in.
Yeah. It's a cliche, but after the People's War, the people wanted a people's peace.
Jeremy, we're going to pause it there. Folks, we'll be back in a moment. You said mass observation was trying to sort of anthropologically trying to look at Britain. But does Home Intelligence, does it draw anything? Can it show us anything about the character of the British people, which is not necessarily what it's trying to do? That's probably more of the objectives of mass observation. But it's quite intriguing to think about it in those 4-year period of its existence.
Yes, I mean, you're right. I mean, the analysis of morale inevitably led Home Intelligence into some assessments of the character traits of the British people. And in October 1941, Stephen Taylor, remember, he's a psychiatrist, he sketched out a portrait of the qualities of the British people, which was a bit reminiscent of George Orwell's The Lion and the Unicorn, which was published in the same year. But anyway, the British, Taylor thought, were pragmatic, full of common sense, and had a stability of temperament, albeit, he wrote, with a slightly gloomy tinge. But they also, he went on, they also had a tendency towards self-righteous indignation when things went wrong, a propensity to regard all officialdom as utterly inefficient, and a distrust of excessive enthusiasm, combined with a masochistic delight in knowing the worst. Delving a bit deeper into the national psyche, he also thought that the British people were fundamentally unimaginative, since despite their perilous position, and I quote from him, the possibility of defeat is neither imagined nor imaginable. In fact, he thought that it would be impossible to defeat the people of Britain by any means other than extermination. And that in a strange way, the public as a whole was happier since the war than it was in time of peace. So anyway, I think there's quite a lot to unpack there. Yeah.
That's the war as a unifying factor. It pulls together ideas of Britain and Britishness that I guess have come along in the previous 40 years, and it focuses it all to give us some form of disunified unity.
Exactly. Yes. And the whole issue of the invisible chain that binds people together, I think, which Orwell sort of talked about as well. So, yeah.
It's fascinating. From a historical value, how valuable are these reports? I mean, I'd never really bumped into them. I've enthusiastically been going through that. They're just absolutely fascinating. But as I keep saying, mass observation is always the one that gets trooped out, is the one that's popular. But how do the reports compare? What is the value of these reports?
Well, I mean, like all historical sources, Home Intelligence reports do need to be read with a kind of critical eye. I mean, Taylor was quite candid about this, actually, and in an explanatory cover sheet to the reports, he warns his readers that the reports dealt in perceptions of public opinion rather than verified facts. He also points out that the reports tend to foreground areas of discontent rather than satisfaction. And also, he's very alert to the fact that the reports needed to be read as a continuous series rather than in isolation from one another. If one was to get a sort of real sense of the fluctuations of of public opinion. And also, as we alluded to earlier on, there were also questions around how effectively the intelligence machinery he constructed was able to excavate all the strata of public opinion. I mean, it's likely, for instance, that working class attitudes were often reported secondhand through middle class panels of regional contacts, and that, aspects of wartime experience are therefore lost somewhere in transmission. Nonetheless, with these provisos, I think the home intelligence reports are an invaluable resource for historians of the home front. I mean, they are methodical and systematic in their compilation, as you can see. They're presented in a standard format. They're indicative of the most important public issues of the moment. They cover all parts of the United Kingdom, and they draw on an impressive array of a range of sources. And if you look at the original reports, they're all supplemented by a full reference apparatus. And I mean, Taylor believed that the reports were, in his words, a surprisingly accurate statement of British public opinion, and he thought convincing evidence of their validity was the fact that there was a very high degree of agreement, which was usually found between the 13 different regional intelligence reports that were coming into London, and that there was no opportunity for collusion. So he likened them to a weekly barometer of sort of public feeling, as it were. I think what's also important maybe to emphasize is that we tend to read history backwards, but the British people, like the compilers of the reports, didn't know what was going to happen next. They had none of the hindsight that we now have. So I think the reports give us a vivid sense of living through an unfolding drama without quite knowing what's going to happen. So it's a bit like looking at history from the other end of the telescope.
Thank you, Jeremy. That's great. It's been a pleasure talking with you. The 3 books prove invaluable to anyone interested in understanding how the British public experienced the war, especially as it's through contemporary reports. Loyal listeners, if you want to explore further this topic, the 3 books are Listening to Britain, The Spirit of the Blitz, and the final volume, Our People's War. I will put a link in the show notes and on the website. If you have enjoyed this podcast, I have some bonus content from Jeremy available exclusively for patrons of the podcast. Not a patron yet? You can sign up at patreon.com/WW2podcast. By becoming a patron, you'll gain access to ad-free episodes, allowing you to fully immerse yourself in every discussion. Plus, you'll unlock occasional exclusive bonus material which might not have made it into the main episode. Your support via Patreon helps me keep the podcast running and growing, ensuring I can continue bringing you engaging and high-quality content. Well, that is it for this episode. Next time, we'll be exploring British cavalry units that were deployed with their horses during the Second World War. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.